It's my pleasure to introduce distinguished songwriter and David Finkelhor is, I don't know if he's ever won an award, Emmy for that, but you must have 7 or 8 published songs, and including if you look on YouTube, you can find about peer review and about science. But in addition to that, David has actually done some other work. He has about 150 articles and 11 books, and is the director of the Violence Against Children. I had it written down, but the Crimes Against Children Research Center at the University of New Hampshire. He's also a professor of sociology. David has been a longtime friend of the Kemp Center. In fact, he and I together, it was in 1994, were external reviewers for the Kemp Center. And he's won numerous awards from a variety of places, including ISPACAN, the International Society for the Prevention of Child Abuse and Neglect, and APSAC, and is probably one of the, I think the highlight of the week is you'll get a chance to meet one of the most distinguished researchers in the field. And this is Dave Finkelhor. And I think the thing that you'll find out about him is he's incredibly approachable and helpful and committed to your well-being. And I think that's what's made him such a successful person at the University of New Hampshire with this program. Thank you. David, you're on. And maybe later we can find on YouTube one of your songs to play for the group.
I might be persuaded to sing one too. Thank you very much. I am very pleased to be here. I have to say that can you hear me okay?
Is that on?
Okay, is it going to be, yeah, you want to? I love this point in the developmental process when people are choosing the topics that they're going to spend a large chunk of their life pursuing. I think it's just one of the most precious moments in the lifespan. People who have an interest in science or social advocacy or whatever. And it's a very interesting inflection point. Some fields, because of interests that grab a generation of people, completely shift and change course as a result. So you are in a position to kind of decide where this field goes in some ways over the next 50 years. And so I think competing for your interests on this are, those of us who are up here urge you to pay attention to stuff that intrigues you about things that we say, but also feel free to go off in some other directions as well. I don't know that I'm going to do you tremendous service here, but what I decided to do was simply talk about some new issues or new developments in child maltreatment or violence against children epidemiology that have been of interest to me in recent months and maybe year or two, things that I've seen primarily related to trends and new topics. But I'll leave time at the end, hopefully, so that if you want to get into stuff that I've not gotten into here, but you think I might know something about, I'd be happy to answer questions about it as well. I'm going to start out with one of the basic elements of our field, which is the, let's see, all right, which is the use of the mouse. There we go. Yeah, okay, oh, okay, that's good, all right. So you're going to get on Wednesday, I guess, an introduction to some of the data sources in the field, so I won't go into them in great detail. But one of the foundational data sources in our field is this National Child Abuse and Neglect Data System, where the federal government compiles state reports of substantiated child maltreatment and statistics on them and makes it available to people every year. It's a very underutilized resource, unfortunately, in the research and policy community for a number of reasons that we can go into if you want. One of the serious shortcomings of this data is that the feds themselves do not really make much of an effort to track long-term epidemiological trends with the data. They don't publish anything about that. It's been left to people like me who look at this and say, well, we want to know what's happening overall and trying to make sense of it, that publish, to massage this data and try and interpret what it shows. And in fact, most people are not aware of what it shows and don't have much, and there isn't much discussion about it. So there was recently a new 2017 data was added to this. And so I've been able to put together up to the most recent. And of course, you may be familiar with the fact that according to this data of substantiated reports on child maltreatment, physical abuse and sexual abuse had been declining pretty consistently and over a period of about 20 years, and very substantially as well, something that I don't think many people in the field aren't aware of, whereas substantiations of neglect had not been declining. But then starting in about 2010, we seem to have gotten to a plateau for physical abuse, and then maybe starting in a few years later, we seem to have gotten to a plateau on sexual abuse as well. And it now looks as though the trends that we saw up until those periods have kind of stopped. That in itself, the understanding exactly what might be going on is interesting. I mean, clearly, this does not reflect anything about socioeconomic trends or anything of that sort, because you can tell that declines continued through some of the periods of recession and actually then had plateaued during some periods of economic growth. And why neglect has a different trajectory from the other trends is also a very interesting question for the field. There's some fairly strong hypotheses that has to do with the expansion of the concept of neglect in practice to include a fair number of cases that involve exposure to domestic violence and exposure to drug abuse. But interestingly, these are not things that have been strongly studied. What the patterns do parallel, though, in a very interesting way, are the patterns for crime in the United States in general. The child physical abuse and sexual abuse, at least, seem to parallel that, including this kind of tailing off of the declines starting in the last, let's see, this goes up to, starting in the, well, kind of since 2013, 14. And suggests that some of the work that's being done in terms of epidemiology of crime may be relevant to the epidemiology of those forms of child maltreatment. This is the data on homicides of young children, which does not show quite the tapering off that we've seen in the physical abuse, but has continued to go down, even in the most recent couple of time periods. This is data that comes from a different source, from the FBI and their, but homicides of children under the age of 4 is a pretty good indicator of effects of parental care and child maltreatment. And it's important to see that at least in that area of child maltreatment, the declines seem to have continued. Yeah.
David, what's the vertical axis? 3 per
100,000. Yeah. 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 There's also data from vital statistics on deaths due to various conditions that are analyzed by some people in our field for signs about trends in child maltreatment. This is interesting. That shows a somewhat different pattern that comes from a recent paper from John Leventhal's group, I believe. Or no, is this the CDC? Oh, this is Joanne Clevens, who's going to be part of she's part of your mentor group here. But it does show a fairly dramatic decline, only in the recent years, in fatal abuse head trauma, The data from population surveys are also another important source of epidemiology about child maltreatment. And they show some interesting patterns as well. This is one of the ones that doesn't get cited very often, but I think is one of the most interesting ones. And they are out recently with some data for 2016 now. This is a survey that is done of every 6th, 9th, and 12th grader in the state of Minnesota. And they ask about sexual abuse, 2 different kinds of sexual abuse, and also physical abuse. And they have shown a pattern of declining sexual abuse over a number of years since the late 1990s. And that pattern, in contrast to the data from the NCANs, has shown continued declines in the most recent period as well. There's also self-reported survey data from the NCVS, the National Crime Victims Survey, which is conducted by the US Department of Justice, that is done every year. And they show continuing declines in sexual assaults, victimizations for young people between the ages of 12 and 17. This data is lifetime, so it includes sexual abuse that would be occurring to younger children that's being remembered by these older kids. Let's see, I better get closer to the pictures here. I put this one up from a recent paper by Janet Lauritsen because it shows some of the convergence among different indicators showing that big decline initially in kind of in the 1990s and early 2000s, and then some additional declines and tapering off for various kinds of indicators. This is some data that we recently reported on the corporal punishment issue. And this relied on some previous work that Adam and his group had done in a paper in Child Abuse Review, looking at several other national studies about spanking. And one of the neat things that we found using our data from our 2014 NADSCAV survey and putting it in conjunction with these other data sets was that it showed that for the first time, a majority of children in this age range were not subject to physical punishment over the course of the past year. The data does show that still a majority of 3 to 5-year-olds do get spanked. But the decline is pretty large from the last data point that we have in 1995. And the decline is particularly strong for the 2 to 4-year-olds and the 5 to 8-year-olds. The study also showed some of the typical other patterns of in the child maltreatment epidemiology, which is a very big regional difference, about a 20% difference between the South and the New England northeast of the United States in this rate, bigger than differences by race or socioeconomic status. What's interesting and a little bit perplexing is that while the actual rates of corporal punishment have declined, the thing that we've been measuring more regularly on this issue over time, which has been people's attitudes about it, an agreement to the statement, it is sometimes necessary to discipline a child by spanking them, has not changed that much. So what it looks like we're seeing is that the attitude measured isn't a very good indicator of what's actually happening. And I don't know how to explain that anomaly. I really would have expected to see the attitudes change as much or maybe even more. But the data is what it is. The thing that has gotten probably the largest amount of attention in the child well-being epidemiology over the last few years, indicating once again how good news doesn't really disseminate very quickly, whereas bad news does, is the fact that teenage suicide rates have been up. And so I think it's really important for us to when we look at the overall child welfare indicators, sort of put this into the context of some of the other data that we're seeing about why we would be seeing these kinds of increases in suicide in the face of other either flat or declining indicators of overall child well-being. But it's a strong multi-year trend that shows that, that the suicide rates for these teenage kids is now as high as it's been in maybe 40 years. And it's been ringing a lot of well-deserved alarm bells. And we can talk about what might be going on here a little bit after I put out some of the more of the epidemiological data. What's interesting though is there are measures of suicidal ideation and attempted suicides. They don't show quite the same increase that the actual successful suicides show, but there is a bit of an uptick for them in the more recent periods here. Interestingly, they show that even that the rates for suicidal ideation, although it's up a bit, are not higher than they were. In fact, they're still quite a bit lower than they were 30 years ago. But if you look at the actual attempts that have required medical attention, at least from the self-report, that looks like it's either flat or up a little bit. This is another issue that's gotten quite a bit of attention, and there is some data about children. This is the one from John Leventhal's group on deaths to children that are linked to opioid ingestion. And they show we've been very concerned about it in terms of the adult population, but you can see also that there have been some fairly big increases among the child population as well. My guess is that these trends represent very different kinds of contexts. For the 0 to 4-year-olds, we're talking about accidental ingestions of opioid substances that are being left around the house or that the child has access to. But for the 15 to 19-year-old population, we're talking about actual intentional drug taking. But it is interesting that the trends seem to be stronger for the very younger kids and a little bit mixed in the pattern for the older kids. Some of the stuff for the older kids may be related to the increasing availability of very highly lethal kinds of drug preparations. Although the opioid increase is a problem, there are actually encouraging trends in other kinds of drug use data. So if you look at the reports from like the Monitoring the Future study, which is a big epidemiological study of high school age children about their usage of drugs and illicit drugs, you find that overall the trends in that have been downward and down quite a bit from their peaks, one of which was in 82 and then another which was in 02. So while drug deaths have been increasing from opioids, the actual usage of illicit drugs has actually been declining for teenagers, as has alcohol ingestion as well. I don't think I have I don't have the data on this, but from the Monitoring the Future study, alcohol usage and driving while drunk and other alcohol usage indicators have also been declining. I've also think it's been important to track some of the indicators about peer kinds of victimization. And these are very interesting as well because they have been showing fairly dramatic declines over a long period of time. So whether you look at data from the Youth Risk Behavior Survey on physical fighting, or if you look at data on bullying from the National Crime Victimization Survey, all of those indicators seem to show pretty substantial improvements up until the most recent time period. The other thing that is really, really astonishing and has received, I think, actually very little attention is the enormous declines in juvenile crime and delinquency perpetration. And these are typically indicators that are measured by arrests and police contacts with juveniles. I mean, a 72% decline over a basically 10-year period is the kind of thing that you almost never see in epidemiological statistics unless some kind of revolution is going on. And yet people are a little bit hard-pressed to know what exactly that might be. I have some ideas about it that I can talk about. But in the face of a lot of people a lot of narratives that you will hear about the dire state of youth in the United States and all the corrupting influences on them, almost nobody ever mentions the incredible declines in juvenile crime and delinquency that have occurred. And what a remarkable thing that's been. I mean, it's for every kind of crime, but it's been large, aggravated assault, which is, serious violence that involves a weapon or injury. It's down considerably for sex crimes committed by juveniles as well. As you might expect, given that we've seen a big decline in juvenile crime and delinquency, the number of juveniles who are involved in who have been incarcerated has also been declining pretty dramatically as well. This is a combination of both fewer crimes being committed and also more concerted policies on the part of states to not incarcerate kids and to treat them in outpatient kinds of situations. But it is a very positive sign in the general child welfare picture that juveniles are being incarcerated a lot less than they were. Now, for a while as well, we saw declines in the number and rate of kids who were going into foster care, along with the declines in incarceration for criminal behavior. But in the last few years of measurement, that actually has turned around. And that seems to more reflect the plateau and rise that we may have seen in some of the child maltreatment data as well. It's still well below the peak that it was in the late 1990s, but it has begun to trend up again. There is some good news in the foster care data, though, that is worth thinking about. The percentage of kids who are in kinship care or in the foster care with a relative has been increasing so that it's now up to about a third as opposed to where it was at about a quarter. But interestingly, the the geographical distribution of those, of the kinship care practice varies enormously. I was very surprised to see this, but you can see very strong regional trends in this with, places in the West, for example, having embraced kinship care to a much greater degree than jurisdictions in a lot of the South. I don't know, maybe there may be other people in the audience who have more ideas about what may be driving this, but it does suggest that there are important policy elements. Oh, gosh. That's interesting. My brother, who almost never calls, decides that this is the moment. The other thing that's been changing about the foster care situation that is worth paying attention to is that the percentage of older kids who are going into foster care has been declining during this period of time. So if during this period of time we've actually been seeing an increase in, at least in the latter part of this period, an increase in the number of kids going into foster care, but the percentage of them that are older has been declining, then obviously one conclusion about that is that even more younger kids are going in. I'm putting all of this up as a way to kind of intrigue you about the questions about, what can explain, what elements in the kind of trends in these phenomena we might be seeing. Something that gets trotted out a lot in trying to account for trends in various kinds of child welfare indicators is, the internet and social media and all the changes in communication that digital technology has brought about. And typically, the explanations that are given are ones that emphasize the negative impacts that these technologies have on young people. And so, for example, when people try to interpret the increase in suicides, they oftentimes say, well, it's isolating kids, it's filling them with FOMA, fear of missing out, and invidious comparisons between their lives and the lives of people that they're observing on the internet. And I think there's been less willingness to consider the possibility that some of these social changes may have had salutary and protective effects on kids as well. And when I look at the decreases in crime and decreases in risk-taking, there's some obvious connections that one can make between the technology and some of these changes. Well, one thing is that juvenile crime tends to occur in part as a result of boredom and the feeling that there's nothing to do and trying to create some excitement and meaning. And I think childhood has probably gotten a lot less boring as a result of all the devices. So, maybe the need to create this kind of alternative forms of excitement have declined. Secondly, a lot of juvenile crime and risk-taking occurs when people get together in groups, in unsupervised situations. My guess is that young people are getting together in groups a lot less frequently. They're doing much more of their socializing in virtual forms. But also that the risk-taking is happening online rather than in face-to-face environments. And in face-to-face environments, it's much easier for risk-taking to turn into actual harm occurrence because people are in the face-to-face situation. Whereas for risk-taking to turn into harm occurrence in the virtual environment requires more steps. So someone has to actually go and get together with somebody before the harm occurs. And it may just be that when people are taking risks in their virtual environment, there are more reminders of things like, well, their parents are not too far away, or I'm in my household, and they're reminded of the standards of behavior. Maybe there's just more kind of normative influence that occurs. Other things that are going on that reflect the technology is just the fact that I think people's sense about the degree to which they can do things and get away with them has changed. That the deal, the compact we have made with the technology is it provides us all these wonderful affordances and capacities, but we know that it has the possibility of tracking us. If I'm having an affair, my cell phone knows that, that I wasn't at the office, or can show that I wasn't at the office, that I was at my paramour's house. And so I think we may have all kind of internalized the idea that we have to clean up our act a bit because of these devices that are everywhere, not just in our cell phones, but also the fact that our communications can be mined for information. I mean, Richard Nixon, most of you at least probably were born after his demise, but he was the first very famous person who got hoisted on his own, his keeping a record of all of his communications. But we all do that now, and I think the lesson was that even the most powerful person could be caught and outed as a result of this technology. And not to mention the fact that there are video cameras everywhere, and I think people recognize that that they are being surveyed. There are undoubtedly other things going on, and I wish we had more data and more people who are interested in looking at the trends in light of all the prevention and prevention education and greater awareness that we have about a lot of these things. Some of the also I have one of the early declines in some of these phenomena. I thought an important issue that ought to be looked into more was the dissemination of psychiatric medication, because of the convergence between the onset of many of these declines that we saw starting in the early 1990s with the authorization for prescription of whole classes of psychiatric medication like the SSRIs, but also the very big increase in the usage of the stimulant medications and the methylphenidate to treat hyperactivity and various kinds of aggressive behavior in young people and risk-taking behaviors. And I think it's entirely possible that we now know that maybe 10 or 15%, maybe it's up to 20% of the youth population taking some form of psychiatric medication now, and that revolution in psychiatric medication may have had some impact on this initial decline in risk-taking behavior. And of course, it was being prescribed to adults as well, so maybe having fewer depressed and anxious parents, and particularly the fact that men were willing to take psychiatric medication as a form of mental health treatment when they wouldn't go to see a psychiatrist or a counselor. This was kind of reaching a whole segment of the population that we hadn't been particularly effective at reaching before. These are all just speculations about things that could be going on that need to be factored in trying to understand some of these trends. But I've been trying to interest people who are thinking about topics of looking at some of this trend stuff and thinking about some research designs that could kind of answer some questions about what explains the trends. And now that we have longer series of trends and some variation in them over time, I think it becomes more, there's a richer kind of historical experience to look at to see if we can find some explanations for what's been going on. I'm going to switch, just cover another few topics. Just want to talk briefly about some new data that we've developed and published about the prevalence of child sexual abuse. I oftentimes get questions about, well, our data, the statistics that are cited in this area are oftentimes pretty old and based on retrospective data of people who probably grew up in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. We have used our big national surveys of children to try and get some better perspective on this. And one of the things we did was just simply put 3 of these surveys together and asked among the 17-year-olds, if we looked at all the kinds of sexual offenses that they had experienced, what were the actual rates? And it turned out that we looked at sexual assault, hands-on, unwanted sexual contact. It was about a fifth of the girls and about 1 in 20 of the boys. But the very important thing that we found, and that has been neglected previously in the epidemiological statistics about sexual abuse, and that I think are very important to emphasize, is that the majority of these kids are talking about assaults and unwanted experiences at the hands of other kids, that the adult perpetrator portion of it, if you just focus on the adult perpetrator portion, which is what people tend to think of when they think of sexual abuse, is more like 11% for the girls and 2% for the boys. And I think that's really important to remind people about because when they hear these big statistics, they all think of it as entirely the adult portion of the problem. One of the suggestions that I've made about how to remind people that we're talking about something broader is to use the term sexual abuse or assault, because abuse is, some people automatically signifies the adult portion of the problem. Whereas when you talk about assault, you reference some other things as well. The other thing that's been happening, and I want to just turn briefly, maybe Des talked a little bit about this, is some of the international perspective. There are some developments in the internet. There are many, many more data points in terms of international rates of various kinds of maltreatment. And I've just been it's time for me to do a really formal meta-analysis of this, but what's really clear, I think, and this is something that we didn't know maybe 10 years ago, is that for some forms of maltreatment, the rates really do vary tremendously in different country contexts. And this shows that, these are from national population surveys that have been done in various places. So the question about why it's high in some places and relatively low in others is a very important one that, we've wanted to have the data. Now we need to kind of get out there and see if we can develop some explanations about what's going on. What I'm afraid is that we haven't really included measures in enough of these international surveys to test some of the hypotheses that we might want to. Based on some of the, for example, it looks as though some of the more kind of conservative, maybe religiously dominated places have somewhat lower rates than, say, some of the places where you don't have those levels of conservatism. I think, for example, some hypotheses that might apply to why girls are less abused and sexually abused in some places than others, that they are places where girls are more protected or not allowed to be alone with men, or not allowed to date in adolescence, or more highly supervised. These are all things that we should be looking at. We may also want to look at issues like related to cultural sexualization. It occurred to me I wrote a particular paper on sexual abuse of girls and boys in China, and some of the cultural research I was doing on that topic, I was very interested to see some of the anthropologists reporting that that in China there are kind of 2 forms of masculinity that receive a high level of endorsement. There is a kind of more conventional Western sort of strength-based, aggressiveness, masculinity, but there's also a kind of more caregiving, paternalism, kind of wise person type of masculinity that has a high value. It raised the question for me whether definitions of masculinity cross-culturally, where there's more emphasis on restraint, less emphasis on public sexual competition, might reduce the amount of sexual predation that occurs if there's masculinity can be attained, valued masculinity can be attained in a different way. These are all things that seem to me to merit some look. So the other thing I wanted to bring to people's attention, because it hasn't received very much publicity, is there's a very big and detailed report on violence against children in the international perspective that has been published by this No Violence group. And they took data from a variety of existing international surveys, and they massaged it in a way to try and obtain violence estimates for all portions of the world and most countries in the world as well. It's a very, I think in some ways, a kind of speculative approach. They used missing data imputation to derive estimates for a lot of countries that didn't really have surveys that had actually been done there. But they do show some things that are very interesting in terms of the kinds of places where there seems to be more violence against kids than in other places. And I did want to highlight, they actually called winners and losers here, which, were some of the places that they picked where kids had low levels of, say, violent discipline in the home were kind of surprising. Places like El Salvador, which currently has one of the highest homicide rates in the world. Turkmenistan, how many people even know where that is on the map? These are places that really ought to, if indeed they are low violence against children places, they are places that ought to get a lot more study. So I think it's a very interesting exercise, although it's a little bit hard to evaluate the quality of the estimates that are being made. There's a big black box behind a lot of these estimates. But I think it's something for those of you who are really interested in epidemiology to look at. Is just I think, let me just talk about one other thing. Two other things. There's some new data out about child sexual abuse images. As you may know, there are big effort now to get countries all over the world and internet service providers all over the world to intercept child sexual abuse images that are being transmitted and get them reported to a central authority, which is the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children in the United States, the Cyber Tip Line. And a recent report out of that tip line showed a really exponential increase in the detection of these images, and showing really what an incredible volume of such traffic there is, up to almost 10 million reports in the last year. I guess that was for 2018. But one of the things that was of most interest to see is how the geographic breakdown of these images has changed over time. There's been decreasing sourcing of this information from the Americas and increasing sourcing of it from Asia. Now, whether that has to do with actual change in the pattern of access or whether this has to do with a change in the reporting participation is really unknown at the present time, but it does really show it to be quite an international. And some of the places that seem to have the biggest burden of access and trafficking are places that might be a surprise. So this kind of heat map shows that if you look at the accessing and transmission in proportion to the population. There are some places that stand out that you might not expect. Finally, one of the big new issues that's been talked about a lot is, once again, the internet and its potentially negative influence on young people. And one of the big worries that has galvanized a lot of people is the young people themselves making and then posting sexual images of themselves. And there's been a recent meta-analysis that got a huge amount of attention, saying that about 14% of all youth had made such sexts, and nearly 30% of them had received them. And this is an example where I'm really concerned, as in much of the internet anxiety, the whole epidemiological area is getting off on a really bad footing. And this is an example for me of garbage in and garbage out, because if you look at this meta-analysis and also a lot of the other studies that have been done about sexting, the definition of sexting typically involves sexually explicit images, videos, and or messages so that they can be non-pictorial. They do not necessarily have to show genitals or breasts. And when we did a study recently where we tried to break down actually what was going on in a much more specific way, the situation looked a lot less dire. So we looked at sexual images alone that could be child pornography under applicable criminal statutes. And this was based on interviews with a national sample of young people. And these were the screeners. I'm going to rush through this. You can come back and look at this. But we really tried to find out what was actually being shown in these pictures. And what we found was that if you really looked at images where they created an image of themselves or someone else that was sexually explicit to the extent of having naked breasts, buttocks, or genitals, we were really down to like under 2% of the youth population who had created such images. There was a larger percentage who had received images, but even here, the percentage of them that was sexually explicit received, so was less. And I think that this partly illustrates the need to, not allow a term like sexting to kind of get utilized in research in a kind of vague and uncritical way, and then to get mashed together in these meta-analyses and that are going to get a lot of press attention because everybody is full of anxiety about this. The other thing that we've done when in our work on sexting is to show that there are very clearly two different categories of these kinds of images. There are what we call aggravated sexting, where there's an adult involved or there's some kind of malicious intent involved. And then there are what we call experimental, where young people are exchanging them with romantic partners or people that they want to get some sexual attention from. And that these have very different implications in terms of how they should be handled by law enforcement, the child protection system, and even parents. But here again, there's not much distinction that's being made in the current sexting literature between the usage of these, the exchange of these images in different contexts. So there's a lot of work really to be done, I think, to set the epidemiology of this whole new field on a kind of better foundation. All right, why don't I stop there and see if you want to interrogate me about any of this stuff in any greater detail or any other topic. Yeah, Dan.
something first, like domestic violence or child abuse, and then something later, like arrests. But it seemed like many of the decreases happened around the same time.
They did.
Weren't related to economic well-being.
Yes.
So I guess I have to ask the question, is it possible that this is related more to cultural changes of what counts as abuse or what cops are willing to do to arrest someone, or where we're willing to put foster care in it? I'm just curious at a very broad level, how much do you think these data are vulnerable to changing definition or cultural about what counts?
Well, I don't think the definitional explanation really is a very strong one for a number of reasons. I mean, if you see these changes across self-report data and agency data, you know, it seems to me the definitional stuff is much more likely to happen at the level of the agencies than they are at the level of the individuals. Secondly, we've had some validational studies, like the NCANS data has been validated by the NIS data, the National Incident Study data, which used consistent definitions across time periods and showed that the declines that were showing up in the NCANS data were actually valid, were actually true when you use these more consistent definitions. So if anything, frankly, I would have thought that because of greater openness, greater discussion, all the publicity, that if anything, the definitions would have expanded. So what you would have seen, and I think maybe it has happened, that the declines that were going on were happening in the face of expanding definitions. People are much more sensitive about what is a sexual, much more expansive in thinking about what is a sexual assault, much more ready to talk about it than they were a generation ago. So I don't find that particularly persuasive, but there may be other things that are going on that we should consider that I haven't mentioned and haven't even thought about. Yeah.
Several of the folks here are interested in looking at exploitation of kids and trafficking. I wonder if any of your survey data help us understand the epidemiology of child trafficking, child sex trafficking.
Well, thank you for asking. It is a bit of a pet peeve of mine. I guess I'll give it to you full blast here. I find that the epidemiology around sex trafficking to be very problematic in a number of ways. First of all, we had a great term to apply to this problem, which was commercial sexual exploitation of children. And somebody decided that it needed to be called trafficking, which in fact is not very accurate. We did a large police survey of over 500 cases that police had documented. The majority of kids who were involved in commercial sexual exploitation were doing it in their own hometown. So they weren't being moved around. A third of them or more didn't have a pimp who was involved. So there wasn't a trafficker. They were doing it on their own initiative. So I think that the term trafficking not only ended up misrepresenting the dynamics of a lot of these offenses, but introduced a whole new confusion because I think most people don't have any idea what trafficking, sex trafficking means. I think commercial sexual exploitation of children was just fine. There are a bunch of numbers running around about how big this problem is. They get recycled and recycled. I've written a whole bulletin about that, basically saying we don't know what the scope is. The estimates that are usually bandied about are like 100,000 up to 300,000 kids are involved. I think that's way high, honestly. When they've actually tried to do more targeted local counts, you get a few hundred kids in various, urban areas that can be documented. I think it's probably more in the order of tens of thousands, but nobody wants to have a number that's that small. It's going to be a very hard phenomenon to count very well, and so I mean it'd be great for people to get involved in this problem, but I think it's very challenging from an epidemiological point of view. The epidemiology that has been done in some local areas shows some things that very rarely get talked about. One of the biggest and best studies that's been done in this area was one that was done in New York City. They actually found equal numbers or maybe somewhat more boys involved than girls. And that's something that almost never gets talked about. I think one of the reasons is, frankly, that the political coalition that has been very important in fostering our mobilization around sex trafficking includes a fair number of conservative evangelical people who are motivated by religious animus about prostitution and that kind of thing, along with people from more conventional child advocacy and child welfare points of view. But I think that it breaks down when it comes to boys, because these tend to be boys who have been rejected by their families because of their homosexual orientation, and having a sense of concern about this population is not sort of part of the political narrative that I think this movement really wants to undertake. There are a variety of other very mistaken notions in this whole field. One of the most frequent statistics that one hears is that young people on average get into sex trafficking at the age of 12 or 13. Just even a common sense look at this statistic makes it clear that that can't possibly be the case. It can't be average. That would mean that for everyone that gets involved in 16 or 17, there would have to be an equal number who are getting involved at 6 or 7. I mean, there are kids who are sexually exploited for commercial purposes by their parents, and that happens, but it's a relatively small part of the commercial sexual exploitation phenomenon. This is a whole social movement that is operating, I think, on a very highly misleading bunch of epidemiological statistics that are still part and parcel of almost every training that you hear around this topic. And I really I'm very saddened when I see that, because it makes me feel like the efforts of people in the child advocacy field to build our advocacy around strong epidemiology has just not been heard in the face of some people who really are keen to push a particular issue. It's not that it's not an important problem, but I do think that there are people who are still misrepresenting its nature and its extent and its dynamics. And it really needs to be put into context, and people need to say, look, you need to slow down and be more honest about what it is that we know. Okay, there's my little rant on that. I think those of you who are getting involved in this field, I have a lot of students who come to me saying they want to study sex trafficking. I'm not exactly sure why they are so entranced with that problem. Oh, here's another part of my rant on sex trafficking. Here's another part of my, yeah, there is more, there is more. We know that kids who are involved in commercial sexual exploitation are multi-problem kids. They typically come, what the research suggests, they typically come from foster care. They typically often have drug abuse problems. They often have dropped out of school. They are lacking in occupational skills. They oftentimes have mental health problems. They have problems that relate to rejection by their families. Given that they have all these multiple problems, I am not at all sure that highlighting this group by virtue of their involvement in prostitution and sexual exploitation is the best way to approach them or the best way to intervene with them. And in fact, there's an effort now to create all kinds of new interventions for this group. And I feel that we have interventions for this group if we look at them through the lens of the being victims of child abuse, being victims of foster care failure, having serious drug and mental health problems, and developing specific sex trafficking programs, I'm not sure is the best way to go. These are untested, unevaluated programs. We have evaluated programs in these other areas that may well be applicable to these kids. And we're creating a silo here again that I'm not sure makes any sense. Thank you. All right, there are a couple people in this room I probably just made very angry or very sad, but yes.
I'm just wondering if you, because we've valuable, and some of us have been around for a while. If you contrast that with other types of issues that occurred in this field in the past, is that kind of phenomenon is not necessarily new.
I'm a little bit unclear what you're asking.
The identification of an issue that just needs a lot of emphasis.
Yeah.
Based on perhaps misleading or not necessarily relevant statistical or epidemiological data, and how that might have ended up in creating, shall we say, diversions in terms of our approaches or policies or practices.
Well, he's asking, I'm going to interpret your question about why we are still so vulnerable to going after child welfare issues in a non-empirical, non-epidemiological way. And I have a concept that I've developed, which I call juvenoia. And it is the exaggerated anxiety about the welfare of children that is based on, you know, trivial kinds of social changes. And as I've analyzed, I think we've done a lot of this. Some of you may not be familiar with this one, but some of you in my generation may. But I grew up, my parents forbid me from reading comic books because there was a big comic book scare in the 1950s. A psychiatrist wrote a book about how comic books caused delinquency. And there were congressional investigations about it, and there was a complete mobilization by law enforcement against the comic book industry on the basis of this. I mean, there are many examples throughout our history where society gets kind of mobilized in the name of protecting children. And it's kind of ironic that we have both these exaggerated mobilizations at the same time that we've had difficulty getting them to pay attention to other kinds of child protection and child welfare issues. It's a very unbalanced area. But I do think that we have some biases in our whole concerns about children that are, some of it are just biosocially ingrained. We have fear, we probably evolved in environments where there were a lot of rival tribes who were going to come in and abduct our kids and take them off. And we have this kind of fear of outside influence and other people who we don't know that puts a whole bias on our ability to kind of think clearly about the welfare of children. I also think that there are big generational issues that, you know, it's very easy for adults to sort of see kids as threats to the status quo because they don't have as much of an investment in the institutions and patterns of behavior that adults have invested a lot of time and effort in. There are also political conflicts between, you know, adults' needs and kids' needs, and that all play into this phenomenon of exaggerated anxiety. But if you look at some of the stuff that, you know, passes for social analysis these days about kids, some of it is pretty ridiculous, you know, and somewhat contradictory, but people seeing the internet as this incredible threat to kids because, you know, they're spending so much time online. I like just to say to people, oh, my daughter spends 9 hours a day reading books. What is this going to do to her social life? We never problematize the idea of a bookish child, but somehow the idea of a child who spends a lot of time on the internet has been problematized. And I don't think we really know much about what that is, but somehow because it's a changed pattern, it puts up all these red flags for people. And I think one of the fundamental responsibilities that people who work as researchers in the child welfare field is to try and keep track of the stuff that is trash versus the stuff that's true, and be willing to go out on a limb and say, look, this is the stuff we should be paying attention to. That stuff over there is not so important. because there's always going to be people who try to hijack the limelight on this thing with topics that are, I think, something of a distraction. Does that address your issue at all? I don't know. No.
I guess the point would be is that this isn't the first time.
No.
What's another example?
Well, the missing children's thing was the whole thing. Missing children was classic. I mean, this was 1984. There were big headlines that there were 500,000 kids that were being kidnapped by strangers. You know, all the missing kids, that's what missing kid meant with somebody. It turns out when we actually did the study, there were about 115 kids who were kidnapped by strangers over the course of a year. There were a lot of kids who were taken by parents. There were a lot of kids who ran away. But this had been misused by the media and the advocates. And it took a long time. And in fact, we're not there yet. Yeah. And it's really sad, but the first people in with claims about various kinds of child protection problems are oftentimes leave an indelible mark that can be very hard to eradicate. And so hard as it may be, we should try to demand more empirical foundations for both the advocacy groups and also the newspapers who pick up on this stuff and run with it oftentimes without vetting what the scientific basis is for the claims that are being made. Yes, okay.
I just want to thank you so much. You can see why David has the